Paul Rodgers is the embodiment of an unspoken truth. As the man who guided Free, Bad Company, and Queen, he is revered as one of the finest voices in rock history. A darker truth, however, lurked concealed behind the glitz. Not rivals or casual disagreements, but well-known bands were what he hated. Rodgers saw them as betrayers who had betrayed rock music. Now that he's 75 years old, he's naming them. More surprising than you could have imagined is the truth. Okay, Fleetwood Mac, let's get started. Paul Rodgers' wrath was most stoked by Fleetwood Mac of all the bands he clashed with. This was no informal disapproval. A long-simmering resentment and emotional scar, it was his Achilles heel. Admiration was the starting point. Peter Green, a guitarist whom Rodgers held in the highest esteem, established Fleetwood Mac in the late 1960s, and the band became a beacon of British blues. At the time, Rodgers considered them friends in the fight to keep rock's raw, emotional core alive. Midway through the 1970s, though, that awe turned into wrath. When Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham joined Fleetwood Mac, the band shifted gears from its rough blues roots to a glamorous California pop sound. Most people thought it was brilliant when Rumors started flying in 1977, and it sold over 40 million copies throughout the world. As far as Rodgers was concerned, that constituted treason. The polished choruses and chart success weren't the only things that infuriated him. It was the band's performance, acting as though their blues past didn't exist. After that, his disillusionment blossomed into outright animosity. He started slamming them in one-on-one chats, saying that their new music was just the blues repackaged as pop gold. Colleagues remember Rodgers literally turning his back as Fleetwood Mac were introduced at a 1977 industry event, spitting that the band's music had become just cocktail party background noise. Those were the remarks of a man who was certain that Fleetwood Mac had forsaken their heritage, sold their soul, and humiliated it by calling their betrayal development. A climate of open animosity had developed by the early 1980s. Rather than merely evading them, Rodgers was outright rejecting their legitimacy. He told his buddies he would politely decline an invitation to perform at a prestigious charity event that also featured Fleetwood Mac. Never perform on stage with a group that trampled blues in pursuit of financial gain. The carvings were protests memorialized in stone. Rodgers, in contrast to many performers who soften with age, became more aggressive and combative. He hated everything about it now. He no longer considered Fleetwood Mac to be fellow musicians. They gave up and ran. While he was around, Fleetwood Mac never once caved to his criticism. McFleetwood justified their innovation by saying it was a necessary next step. Rodgers' anger was fueled by that lack of interest. The act of experimenting did not enrage him. Even he had changed from being Free to being Bad Company. But he thought Fleetwood Mac had sinned when they put their commercial fame ahead of their cultural heritage. He couldn't forgive himself for making that decision. It was disheartening. The story's tragic quality stems from the length of time the animosity persisted. Rodgers was unable to conceal his disdain even in subsequent interviews. He would say that the biggest singles by Fleetwood Mac are just lies, and that their success has meant the end of global recognition for British blues. As he looks back on his career at the age of 75, Rodgers continues to talk about the holy obligation of authenticity and how Fleetwood Mac violated that vow. Relatives and friends claim he gets uncomfortable just thinking about them, as if the scar will never go away. The effects of this animosity extend beyond a single feud. In it, Rodgers lays forth his complete worldview. Rock was never intended to be a commercially viable, safe, or shiny option. To him, Fleetwood Mac was the embodiment of all that was wrong with the world. For him, they represented the turning point when rock became just another product rather than a threat, and he could never forgive them. The Windy City. In the same way that Fleetwood Mac stood for treachery, Chicago stood for tragedy. Like seeing a dear friend discard an irreplaceable gift, Paul Rodgers mourned the band's transformation into something he despised. Chicago was a pioneering city in the 60s and 70s. They created ambitiously pulsating music by fusing rock and jazz, horns and guitars. The band's willingness to experiment and push rock to new heights was on display in songs like Beginnings, 25, or 6 to 4. Rodgers thought it was commendable of them. The band Chicago proved, in his opinion, that clever and risk-taking rock music could retain its essence. According to him, they then discarded everything. Chicago departed from the pioneering horn-driven fusion sound by the late 1970s. They mostly focused on sweet ballads, which are more commonly heard on adult contemporary radio. Ballads such as If You Leave Me Now, 1976, and Hard to Say I'm Sorry, 1982, were regarded by the world as lovely, evergreen classics. They were evidence of creative suicide in Paul Rodgers' view. He was infuriated not by the song's popularity, but by the symbolism of retreat that they represented. Despite their brilliance, the band has decided to diminish themselves. Producer James William Gershow, who had worked with Columbia Records before, recalled Rodgers' pain vividly. In rock music, Chicago made a real breakthrough, but then they abandoned it all to become a Vegas lounge act. They wasted lightning that was in a bottle. This was unpleasant for Rodgers. It was disappointing beyond words. According to him, Chicago was a band that dared to experiment before settling into the tried-and-true genre of love ballads and casual radio. At a European jazz rock festival in 1980, Rodgers' resentment burst forth. Promoters attempted to book him alongside Chicago, but he rejected categorically. "I won't rejoice in the demise of musical aspirations, regardless of the financial reward," he reportedly told eyewitnesses. There wasn't an attention-seeking male involved here. He was standing firm on his principles and would not budge from this position. He saw Chicago as a symbol of how even groundbreaking artists may sell out their history if they lose their bravery. What about Chicago's take on it? No sound. They refrained from openly responding or even acknowledging Rodgers' contempt. Maybe it was the silence that said everything. Their ballads were bringing the band millions and topping charts all over the globe. They might get away without providing an explanation. That apathy was like icing on the cake for Rodgers. It was evidence, in his opinion, that Chicago had grown stale and content with its commercial prosperity and had abandoned the untamed inventiveness that had previously represented the city. The profound impact it had on Rodgers' outlook on life is what heightens the tragedy of the event. As if their decline were personal, he frequently spoke about Chicago with obvious grief rather than casual irritation. He likened their metamorphosis to a funeral for vanity. He thought Chicago proved that risk-taking and innovation could be successful in the mainstream, but they later disproved his theory. Rodgers, who is 75 years old now, still refers to Chicago as the band who devastated him. He still isn't receptive, still hasn't done a classic pop version of their ballads. They continue to serve as a cautionary story for him in the rock genre, demonstrating that even brilliant people can prioritize safety over bravery. As he reflects on the past, he lists Fleetwood Mac as the first forgiven band and Chicago as the second, a tribute to REO Speedwagon. Kevin Cronin's performance of Keep On Loving You before an enthralled audience was an unforgettable sight for Paul Rodgers. People waved lighters and kissed in the aisles as the audience moved to the music. Rodgers, however, perceived treachery rather than love. He didn't consider this to be rock and roll. This was sentimental theater, the gentle kind that took the edge off of musical performances. "This isn't rock, it's wallpaper," Rodgers whispered to a buddy as he watched Cronin's balladry. He permanently blacklisted REO Speedwagon at that point. This was not always the case. Rodgers put up with REO as a stubborn Midwest band in the beginning. Riding the Storm Out and other albums by Gary Richrath added a rocking, honest edge to their sound. It was Rodgers' opinion that the band possessed some of the raw energy that, in his view, was essential to rock, and he thought they were competent, if not revolutionary. However, according to Rodgers, REO's decision in the 1980s was their undoing. Smooth, radio-ready songs replaced their barroom banter. It was a tremendous success. After its 1980 release, High Infidelity went on to sell over 10 million copies in the United States alone, becoming a cultural phenomenon. Hit songs that were ingrained in American popular culture included Keep On Loving You and Can't Fight This Feeling, which dominated MTV and the charts. REO weren't merely popular, they were ubiquitous. Rodgers was enraged by its pervasiveness. It wasn't enough that they transformed. Their new persona became the embodiment of American rock on a global scale. The way Rodgers spit out his contempt was described by Ron Alexenberg, a former executive at Epic Records. Real rock band REO shifted their focus to creating music for wedding receptions. American rock is now more of a background score for those who don't enjoy the genre. Bad Company also sold platinum, so it wasn't jealousy speaking. The attitude was one of utter disdain. For Rodgers, REO had tamed rock to a comfortable, pleasant, and forgettable level. Seeing how they were welcomed abroad was what finally broke him. Rodgers witnessed an international audience at a European event in 1983 enthusiastically singing along to REO Speedwagon songs as if they were the epitome of American rock strength. Degrading was how he felt about it. He exploded behind the scenes, saying, "We've lost the danger, the rebellion, everything that made it matter when foreigners think this represents American rock." It was a public admission of cultural loss, not a minor gripe. The animosity that Rodgers felt motivated him to take action. When asked to appear on banknotes alongside REO, he politely declined. He turned down invitations to events honoring their achievements in the sector. He was forthright when asked for his opinion by the media. Instead of patting you on the head, rock should seize you by the throat. REO prioritized coziness over bravery. By coexisting with them, Rodgers would have been essentially condoning the kind of compromise he strongly disliked. And where does REO stand? Asserting that their ballads were heartfelt compositions, Kevin Cronin dismissed the criticism. That defense was ridiculous in Rodgers' opinion. In his view, bravery was nothing without taking risks. Pantheism was at work. He felt as though Rick Rath's guitar, which had formerly been a powerful instrument, had been muffled by excessive manufacture. Now, the same artist he had hoped would make it big in the music industry represented all that he despised about mainstream rock. Nothing has changed, even after all these years. Even at the age of 75, Rodgers cautions aspiring musicians against becoming just another REO, his acronym for bands that become irrelevant due to their excessive self-promotion. Their story, in his view, serves as a warning that even real rock bands might compromise their integrity for the sake of chart safety. He sees them as more than simply an unlikable band. They represent the pinnacle of music fading into the background and a permanent stain on rock's reputation. Steve Howe, Jeff Downes, Carl Palmer, John Wetton, and Asia. The combination of Yes, King Crimson, and Emerson, Lake, and Palmer's genius should have made this combo seem unbeatable on paper. These individuals were, in Paul Rodgers' opinion, among the most groundbreaking rock pioneers of all time. Still, Rodgers didn't sense awe when Asia's 1982 debut album sold millions of copies. He was repulsed. He couldn't understand how such idealists could be content with such a mundane proposal. He didn't think Asia was a showcase for talent. All that effort went to waste. They didn't venture into unexplored rock terrain, instead producing what Rodgers secretly called lowest common denominator rock, music meant to please the largest potential audience rather than inspire. A form of artistic deceit, genius opting for mediocrity, was perceived by the man who had devoted his lifetime to protecting authenticity as Asia's platinum victory. John Cladner, a former executive at Geffen Records, claims that Rodgers shook his head in disapproval when the album reached #1. As if observing Picasso's decision to paint house numbers instead of masterpieces were like watching a live performance. This scathing analogy shows how much he felt betrayed, not by Asia's presence, but by their decisions. Rock, in Rodgers' upbringing, meant danger, fire, and soul. He couldn't hide his disappointment that Asia had prioritized business security over creative risk. In response to a question concerning Asia's record-breaking success, Rodgers unleashed one of his savage attacks at a 1983 event for the music industry. Perhaps it would be best for us to remain innocent and undernourished if wisdom results in giving in. The comment was hurtful because it went right to the core of what it means to be Asian. Despite their years of experience and expertise, Rodgers got the impression that these individuals had given up. Rodgers felt the pain much more acutely because of the contrast. He recalled the explosive experiments of Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, the nimble brilliance of King Crimson, and the risky improvisations of Yes from the early 1970s. No matter how imperfect they were, those bands showed courage. In their pursuit of innovation, they endangered the approval of their target demographic. As a counterpoint, Asia seemed to be the polar opposite. The men who were trailblazers in progressive rock are now just background music. Rodgers could not pardon the precipitous decline from his former glory. Asia as a whole appeared unconcerned. The band's melodic style was defended by John Wetton, who stated that their goal was to connect with fans rather than merely impress critics. However, that was the exact issue according to Rodgers. Secure connection, risk-free music. He had no problem with aesthetics or music. There were plenty of ballads penned by Bad Company, but he hated what he thought was intentional restraint, especially when it comes from men who are capable of higher things. The domino effect was what really got under his skin. Seasoned artists, inspired by Asia's enormous success, formed comparable supergroups, pursuing commercial formulas rather than risky innovations. Rodgers perceived it as a contagious illness sweeping the industry, a flood of promising young artists being sidelined in favor of safe, corporate-approved singles. The polished product from Asia felt like a cultural betrayal to a man whose life had been founded on the concept that music should be dangerous. The mere mention of Asia still makes Rodgers uncomfortable. He concedes that they were talented enough to be considered among the most groundbreaking thinkers of their day. But they decided to aim lower, at least in his head. He has said of them in interviews that they were the band that demonstrated that being brilliant is no assurance of being great. Even the most brilliant people can water down their talents for the sake of guaranteed sales, and Asia is a symbol of this for him. After hearing Lou Graham's voice on American radio for the first time, Paul Rodgers stood motionless. Furious, not with admiration. It seemed like the worst kind of sellout to Rodgers. The band was Foreigner, Mick Jones's transatlantic endeavor. A British musician who, in order to make polished songs for American radio, left behind the deep blues rock heritage of his native country. Despite the rumble of the guitars and the soaring of Graham's vocals, Rodgers detected compromise rather than authenticity, and he could not forgive it. Rodgers didn't hold back when asked to explain his anger about Foreigner. Not that Mick Jones was untalented, just the contrary. Jones was well known to Rodgers as a skilled musician. A sense of betrayal washed over Rodgers when Jones uprooted to New York and assembled a band customized for U.S. radio play. Producer Jack Douglas claims that Rodgers told friends that he cleaned up British rock so it would appeal to Americans. He transformed our culture into a marketable product. Someone was accusing them of cultural treason, not only criticizing them. What made matters worse was the Foreigners' meteoric rise to success. By the late 1970s, the American charts were ruled by hits such as Cold as Ice, Hot-Blooded, and Feels Like the First Time. Every FM station in the country was playing Urgent by 1981. It was about a girl like you. Millions of people found it exciting. It was embarrassing for Rodgers. In Foreigner's view, British rock bands were using borrowed accents and formulas created by committee to redefine their image abroad. He was unapologetic about his wrath. In 1981, during a London industry meeting, Rodgers allegedly told his co-workers, "I won't shake hands with people who've sold their musical passport for a bigger bank account." And he purposefully avoided Foreigner's representatives to avoid making eye contact. That was not an exaggeration. According to Rodgers, Mick Jones had genuinely given up on being the face of British blues. He claimed that many immigrants had become cultural tourists, faking it to get a better job offer rather than being authentic. The non-native speakers never expressed regret. When asked about his desire for a sound to dominate U.S. radio, Mick Jones was very forthright in interviews. It was merely that, according to Lou Graham, they were composing music that people wanted to hear. Rodgers took their remarks as further evidence of all the things he hated. Decreasing music to a commodity, crafted for profit rather than inspired by heart. In contrast to Foreigner, Rodgers stood alone as they played to stadiums, solidifying his character as an unyielding individual. When Rodgers saw how much of an impact they had on other British musicians, his animosity intensified. He detested it when newer bands tried to emulate the recipe for crossover success by adopting an American-friendly style that was popular among foreigners. It proved to him that Jones had betrayed more than just his own heritage. His example had inspired others to do the same. The Foreigners didn't merely alter their behavior, they contaminated the water supply, Rodgers adamantly told a journalist once. It was the early 1980s when the schism became irreparable. Rodgers would never pay Foreigners' bills or recognize their achievements as valid. He saw their national anthems as empty triumphs, evidence that arenas could be filled through compromise, but integrity would be sacrificed in the process. He had strong feelings about Foreigner, unlike with other bands. He used them as proof negative of rock music's commercialization. Rodgers hasn't gone soft at 75 years old. Despite the lack of animosity between them, Foreigner remains one of his most enraged bands. This is not due to any kind of personal animosity, but rather to his belief that the band embodies the time when British rock became American commerce. He still views them as warning signs of what happens when tradition is watered down for commercial success, rather than as peers. Journey. Upon hearing "Don't Stop Believing" blaring from the speakers, Paul Rodgers was first taken aback in the early 1980s while backstage at an American event. With loud voices and pumped fists, the audience erupted in a shout. Standing aside, Rodgers maintained an expressionless countenance. Anger spread across his face. He didn't find the anthem inspiring. The sound of rock music being turned into a product echoed. Exploration has been reduced to a jukebox, he whispered. With that, Journey became one of the few bands that Rodgers genuinely loathed. Knowing what Journey was like in the past made Rodgers furious. Before Steve Perry became a member, Journey were daring progressive rock experimenters who played around with jazz rock frameworks and grandiose instrumental parts. To Rodgers, that was important. They may not have been blues-based, but they certainly weren't afraid. Next was the turning point. After Perry joined the band in 1977, Columbia Records encouraged them to write songs with catchy catchphrases for radio. There was no longer any spontaneous risk-taking. By the time their 1981 album Escape ruled the charts, Journey had transformed into the pinnacle of arena rock ballad machines. Hits like Faithfully and Open Arms were considered classics by all. To Rodgers, they embodied everything he despised. Music made with the intention of uninspiring and unoffending no one. In hindsight, he would see Journey's metamorphosis as the end of creative bravery. He thought they had gone from being explorers to jukebox makers. Walter Yetnikoff, who had previously served as president of Columbia Records, recalled Rodgers' dissatisfaction. Journey traded their compass for a calculator, he told me straight. Their achievement didn't make him envious. The fact that they had given in frightened him. The pain was encapsulated in that one word, surrender. According to Rodgers, these artists formerly had the opportunity to break new ground, but they opted for consistency instead, reducing soul to demographic data and risk to formula. The invitation to Rodgers to participate in a panel discussion on career reinvention in 1982 only served to intensify the animosity. He said no. I won't rejoice in the demise of creative bravery solely for the sake of increased record sales, he allegedly told event organizers. That was authentic Rodgers, stubborn, unyielding, and not prepared to pretend that Journey's success was due to anything other than business acumen. In private, he was just as outspoken. Rodgers exploded at his own bandmates while in poor company, claiming that Journey's ballads had become the theme song for a time when people confused being safe with being great. We have lost something fundamental about risk, he fumed, when people from other countries assumed this is American rock. While he was alive, Journey were more than just a band. At the heart of rock, mediocrity had supplanted rebellion, and they proved that risk-taking was no longer profitable. Of all things, Journey was never involved. Steve Perry justified their approach by claiming that the band's ballads were born out of genuine feeling. That made Rodgers scowl. What he meant by genuine emotion was the hardness, blues, sweat, and reality of life's experiences. He thought Journey's polished ballads were perfect for the masses. What passed for honesty was actually calculated earnestness. Rodgers hasn't shifted his position at 75 years old. He frequently cites bands like Journey as the moment when rock went from dangerous to comfortable in interviews when asked about the genre's current position. Safe music isn't rock, he once declared. Subdued music is considered safe. He doesn't see Journey as just another popular band. They show how easily talent can be exchanged for praise. The 6 bands that Paul Rodgers would never forgive are now in your hands. It wasn't merely a matter of style or sound to him. In his view, they betrayed the basic essence of what rock music should represent. However, how do you feel? In your opinion, was Rodgers correct to expose them? Or maybe he was simply too resistant to change to consider it? Leave a comment with your ideas. Did you find Journey, REO Speedwagon, Asia, Foreigner, or Fleetwood Mac to be the most disappointing? To ensure you don't miss the next in-depth exploration of rock's most surprising truths, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell button.